In previous videos, we talked about what the cloud is, how to choose a service provider, and we touched lightly on data centers, security, and disaster recovery. In this session, we want to talk a little bit more detailed about all of those three topics. And also, I have the honor of being joined by an expert who can really help us dig deeper into some of these topics. And this is Joanie Mann, who's joining us.
Hi, my name's Joanie Mann, as Geni just said. And I've been involved in application hosting for a lot longer than I care to admit, frankly.
And I know Joanie for her bunny slippers. What was that all about, Joanie?
Oh, bookkeeping and bunny slippers. It's all about being able to work anywhere, anytime, and nobody can see your feet on a conference call.
Yeah, bunny slippers are cool. So, Joanie, let's just jump right in here. So when we're talking about data centers, why should I care as a client of a solution provider? What do I need to know about that?
Oh my goodness, there's a lot of different aspects about the data center, and the data center represents in some cases the actual key to the capabilities of the service provider. We've got different situations that we need to be really considering about, location, for example, being one of the big aspects of the data center. What is the geography of the data center? Is it in seismically active locations where it's prone to earthquakes? Is it near water where it's prone to flooding? Is it, in an area where it's prone to fires? So the physical location, the proximity of that data center to risk areas is really quite an important consideration. Another thing is we need to be concerned about how far the data center is away from us.
What does that do to me?
Well, the longer the information has to travel the wire, the longer it's going to take.
So I want it to be as close to me as possible.
Exactly. You're going to get better performance if your data center facility, is closer to you.
So if I know that my service provider has multiple data centers, does that solve my problem?
Simply having multiple data centers doesn't necessarily solve the problem. That's where we start talking about how the provider uses the data center. For example, are they replicating data only, using it for backup sort of a situation, or are they actually replicating entire systems so that they can deliver full services from those different areas?
So I thought I just needed to worry about my data, but what I also need to worry about is everything else, all the applications that the data is running in and all of that stuff. I need to make sure that all of it is going to be available when I need it.
Yeah, that's
Makes
absolutely
sense.
right.
So now let's move on from location, which is important. So you're saying that the California earthquake zone is not my number one place to put a data center?
Yeah, maybe not the best place to put it.
Having lived through an earthquake in my zone, I can say you don't want to put much of anything along that fault line, but okay,
Right.
So that makes sense. So how do I dig into that when I'm looking at a service provider? How do I make sure that I know, they're going to give me all of that info?
Generally they will. You want to know where their physical locations are, where their data centers are located. And you can do a little bit of research yourself to kind of understand, what risks those locations might potentially, present. But most service providers, if they're using high-tier data centers, those data centers themselves are going to already have a lot of the properties, that the service provider needs in terms of the facility providing redundant power, being able to provide redundant connectivity, many different areas of redundancy even within the data center facility. So, the service provider is going to be able to take advantage of whatever it is the data center provides. And so a top tier data center, is obviously the most desirable.
So Joanie, what should I look for in terms of performance? When I move to a hosting provider, what should I expect, and what determines what kind of speed I'm able to experience?
Well, there's a lot of different factors that impact the speed and the performance of your cloud service, whatever kind of cloud service that is. One of the biggest initial impacts is your own internet connection.
Bummer, I can't blame everything on them.
That's right. And that dial-up AOL connection's not going to do you any good anymore. So it's besides having a great internet connection, having broadband, high-speed internet, one of the big keys is to make sure that the upstream or the upload and the download speeds are roughly the same. We call that being synchronous. And the big reason for that is because with our particular type of technology, the type of technology that the hosting providers are delivering, we expect a character, for example, typed on the keyboard to make a round trip to that server, show up on, register on the server, and then come back and show up on the screen immediately. And if we don't see that happen, that's latency and that type ahead kind of situation. More often than not, that's simply a function of your internet connection, maybe being able to download things more quickly than it can upload them. So there's just kind of a disconnect in trying to synchronize that data going back and forth. Beyond your own internet connection, now we're talking about the things that the service provider control. And when it comes to the service provider, the big things that they have to concern themselves with is, for example, modern technology. Computing technology has evolved, and so the service provider has to make sure that they're using modern equipment, running modern operating systems, and they have to have a certain amount of agility to be able to upgrade those and to refresh that equipment, maybe even on a 2-year cycle. Try to afford that in-house.
Yeah, that's not going to happen.
Yeah, exactly.
We're going to work that machine as long as we can.
That's exactly right. So with the service provider, that's one of the key aspects, is that they have to be using modern computing technology. And even more than that, as that technology evolves, they need to be able to find ways to integrate that into their solution. For example, instead of using spindle hard disks, which used to be the way all the storage was on hard drives. Well, now we're talking about SSDs, solid state drives, and flash drives. And with no moving parts, those drives can operate so much more quickly. Which increases application load times, it increases data access times, and all of those different things that together represent the performance on the system.
There's a lot to consider when we're looking at that, and it's great that we don't have to worry about it. What we have to know is that the provider has taken all that into account if we have the right one.
Exactly.
So that's good news. Good news for me. Okay, Joanie, so you slipped a word in there that I want you to drill into a little bit. Redundancy. What does that mean? That's not just me repeating myself.
The Department of Redundancy department kind of thing. Yeah, no, well, redundancy is just that, is, many replications of the same thing. So when we look at the data center, which is obviously our topic of conversation, we're looking at all of the different aspects of redundancy even within that data center. Now, the service provider is going to have redundant equipment, redundant networking, and all of those types of things. But when it comes to the facility itself, the building and the electricity, if they lose electricity, is there another source of electricity? If they lose whatever sources of electricity they have, do they have a generator? Is there fuel for the generator? Can they get more fuel for the generator? Internet connectivity. Do they have more than one provider? Because that would really be depressing for a cloud provider to lose, the internet.
Depressing for everybody.
Depressing for everybody. So we're talking about, myriad levels of redundancy, from the lowest level that, 2 hard drives in a machine or something like that, all the way up to, not 2 copies of the building. Well, maybe we are talking about 2 copies of the building. This is why many service providers are going to have multiple locations, because they're looking at redundancy not only within that particular facility, but redundancy of their services across perhaps multiple facilities.
So we have redundant hard drives. So I have a hard drive one place and a second place. I have redundant machines, and now you're saying that we need to worry about redundant actual data centers.
Absolutely.
Does everybody have that?
No, absolutely not.
I have multiple locations, aren't I? Automatically redundant in terms of my facility?
Well, let's maybe look at that as it compares to your own office, for example. If you've got multiple backups of your data, that's useful, but it doesn't recover your system in its entirety. So when you're looking at service providers, the same thing is true. There might be data replicated to another data center facility, but that's not necessarily going to bring a customer back into production if one of those facilities goes away.
So I need to really understand what they're saying when they tell me certain pieces of data, because it doesn't always mean the same thing. Okay, so there's this big topic, this thing that keeps us all up at night. What about security? What do I need to know and understand, and what am I looking for when I talk to my data provider, when I'm trying to choose one?
Just trust me. That's all you
Put that on the tagline and I'm covered. Good.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Now, with security, it's a big question. It's a lot like redundancy. There's a lot of different pieces to it. We talk about the physical security in the data center, biometric controls, secure locks, all sorts of different things that are going to prevent unauthorized access into the facility, into the computers, etc. You don't want somebody walking in the room and kicking your server over or something like that.
Spilling their coffee,
hitting it with a vacuum, whatever. But in addition to the physical layer of security, now we've got the network layer. So we've got the transport, the information that's moving perhaps from the servers to your location and back, or even within components within that data center facility. So we've got firewalls, we've got all sorts of different technologies that are brought to bear to secure the network itself and the information that's being transported across the network.
We got to worry about viruses and malware too. So we want all that in the network as well.
Well, we want to protect the network from all of those types of things. So that's, segmentation, keeping different pieces of customer deliveries separate from each other so that they can't,
So one of the things that I've run into, and from my own experience in being in a hosted environment, is this ability to have a break on my data impact your data. How does that happen when you're in a hosted environment?
Well, that kind of gets down to architecture, and networking security, the way that the service provider sets it up. There are circumstances where there might be shared resources. You might have a server and another customer might have a server, but those servers might be connected via a common network. And what that does is that creates a path from one machine to another, perhaps. So if your machine gets involved with malware or something like that, it could easily traverse the network and go involve other customers. And so, having security that creates those barriers and segments that protects and contains each of those deliveries is really quite important. And then we have to take it down to the user level.
Oh, those darn users.
Yeah. It'd be so much
gotta love
better
them.
if we didn't have the users
That's right.
to worry about, right?
That's right.
Well,
So what happens there? How can I make sure that, so I have a team of remote workers, how can I make sure that one of those rogue workers doesn't bring something in to my entire environment?
Well, quite an awful lot of that is just user education. Don't click on the email, don't go to the malicious website, all of those kinds of things. But user behavior is something that's very difficult to control. I think most IT managers have figured that one out, which is pretty much why we don't give most end users administrative access to the system. That's part of securing the overall system. If my account doesn't have permission to do terrible things, then it's less likely that even if I make a mistake and click on that bad email, it's less likely that it's going to actually get somewhere in the system and do some damage.
So the rights and permissions are going to limit my ability to do damage to everybody else.
Absolutely.
Okay, great. So Joanie, let's talk about disaster recovery. We had fires in the Napa Valley and our whole office was set up for remote access. We had a server in the office and the electricity was out. So our server's dead. We have people remotely working from their homes and no ability to do anything. So how can we prevent that when we go to a hosted solution?
Well, that comes back a little, we touched on that a little bit earlier when we were talking about redundancy. And that's really the key. So for example, you're a server. You have a backup.
Yeah, I had all my data.
That's great.
We're great.
That's awesome.
We walked around with our tape.
Yeah, okay. So you needed to go get another server. Now you need to reinstall all of your software. You've got to reconfigure all your software, create all your users, all of this other stuff, restore your data, and now you're potentially back into production. So there's quite an awful lot of recovery there that has to occur before you can get back into, any level of real productivity. So when we talk about disaster recovery, we're talking about so much more than just a data backup. We're talking about replicating the entire infrastructure, taking basically a snapshot of your server and replicating that to another location and having that equipment essentially on standby. So it's sitting there, it's warm, it's ready, and it's loaded, so that if something happens at a facility or with a piece of equipment, there is another redundant facility or piece of equipment ready to just jump in and take over that workload. And that's really unique amongst a lot of the service providers.
If I'm running my own little server, there's no way that I'm going to have a second one somewhere else completely set up. I can't do that on my own.
No, that's generally a fairly expensive value proposition for a lot of businesses. And for the data center, for the service provider, it's also a very expensive value proposition But that level of disaster recovery is the thing that allows business continuity. It allows the organization to not only stay, operational, but fully operational and keeping their people productive.
30 staff people unable to work for a week. I mean, that's a huge cost, so it's worth it to me to be able to fund it with somebody. You have an insurance policy, basically.
That's exactly right.
Hosting provider.
Yeah, so when you talk to your hosting provider and you ask them about their disaster recovery, we're not talking about, do they just have a copy of my data in a different location? The real question is, can they take workloads that are fully operational in a facility and nearly instantaneous or within a very, very short time frame, can they redeliver those workloads from other facilities and keep the customer operational? That's really what we're talking about with disaster recovery.
That's a very different story than what we think. We all think we're covered with that backup tape that we can't get access to.
Yeah, sorry. Hate to tell you, but that tape backup's not really the rest of the story.
So now I know why you have bunny slippers, Joanie, because you're staying up all night having nightmares about what could happen if somebody's not covered. And so you have to have good slippers to pace the house to try to deal with your anxiety. Is that it?
That's it.
That's what it is. Okay, so thanks a lot for spreading the nightmares to me now. So now we know what to look for in a hosting provider. We need to make sure that they have a proper data center, that they've got all the security handled for us, and that we are positioned well for business continuity and disaster recovery. So now with that, you're all prepared. Go get your own bunny slippers and get ready to take a journey to the cloud.